Here's a stat that'll stop you right in your tracks. 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation, and a full 90% lose it by the third generation. Not because they weren't smart, not because they didn't work hard, but because they never built a bedrock foundation. Today's all about building wealth that will actually survive you. Here's the uncomfortable question. What if you accumulate wealth and it disappears in one generation? What if you build all of this and it doesn't matter? What if on paper you succeeded, but privately you're wondering, is this it? What's the point of all this? I've met a lot of very successful people in the $5 to $25 million net worth range, right? On paper, they're quote unquote successful in the eyes of society, right? They've won the game of life, but there's something that's unsettled inside of them. The income is there, the portfolio is there, the reputation is there, but the legacy, it's not yet defined. And that's what this episode is all about. Welcome back to the Sage Investor Podcast. I'm Brian Spear, and my mission is to help as many people as possible generate cash flow and build legacy wealth in a tax-efficient manner, because that's what I'm trying to do for my family. We're going to help as many people as possible do that as we can along the way. And today, we arrive at the final pillar of our 7-pillar framework, the Sunrise C.A.P.I.T.A.L strategy. C, cash flow. A, add value. P, protect the downside. I, invest, don't speculate. T, tax-efficient structure. A, assurance of outcome. And now, L, legacy built to last. This is the culmination. Everything that we've discussed up to this point has been preparation. It's been structure, discipline, durability, margin of safety, compounding. In my studies, here's how a sage investor thinks about legacy. They got 3 principles here. Principle number 1, think in generations. Principle number 2, separate bedrock capital from lifestyle capital. And principle number 3, transfer wisdom before wealth. Survival gets you durability. Durability gets you freedom. Freedom gives you the ability to think beyond yourself. So let's reframe everything that we've done so far here. Cash flow first, and that removes anxiety. Add value. That creates control, where you control your own destiny. Protect the downside. That preserves survival. Invest, don't speculate. That extends your time horizon. Tax efficiency. That protects compounding. Assurance of outcome. That increases the likelihood, the probability that you're going to be successful. But none of that matters. None of that matters unless it actually leads somewhere. And that somewhere is legacy. You know, there's a saying that I absolutely love, that I absolutely adore, that I've taken to heart here. And, you know, it's all revolving around the fact that money doesn't buy happiness. If you follow this plan, right, the capital strategy plan, we've been doing it for a long time. It is much more of an inevitability that you're going to be successful in due time, right? Real estate's not a get-rich-quick style of business over a short period of time with a low probability of success. It is a build massive amounts of wealth over a very long period of time with a very high probability of success, but you have to actually be an investor. But what we know is that money doesn't buy happiness. Even if you get to the promised land, there's a lot of individuals that have 8-figure net worths and beyond that actually are having very difficult lives. They're not happy. So what is happiness, right? There's a great saying that I love, that I just cherish here. And it's, if you want to be happy for a day, buy some dessert. If you want to be happy for a week, take a vacation. If you want to be happy for a month, go buy a new car. But if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, be someone that people will miss when you're gone. And that speaks to legacy. That speaks to legacy. Really close friend of mine named Scott ultimately told me something once that I've never forgotten regarding the idea and the concept of legacy. It was about estate planning, right? At the end of the day, estate planning, if you do it properly, right? You set up your will, you set up your trust, you do an exceptional job of setting up an exceptional estate, passing along a legacy. The truth is, estate planning done properly is the ultimate love letter. Let that sink in a little bit, right? It's not paperwork. It's not tax avoidance. It's not legal structuring. It is a love letter, the ultimate love letter. It says, I love you enough to protect you from ruin. It says, I love you enough to design your freedom. I love you enough to think beyond my own lifetime. Legacy is not about our own demise. Everybody, unfortunately, is going to meet that at some point in the future. There's a 100% success rate in that occurring in time. It's a sad state of affairs. It's not about death, right? It's about continuity. It's about continuity. And the greatest expression of love is not emotional, it's structural. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and lay the foundation here, okay? If your grandchildren inherited all that money tomorrow, would it serve them or would it burden them? That's not a rhetorical question. So let's move on to the three principles that we have here and the how to actually go about building a legacy, right? If you want a legacy that's built to last, how do you go about doing it? We have three ironclad principles inside of the Sunrise Capital strategy that we follow to build that legacy. The first one is to think in generations. You need to think in generations and not days, because the decisions that you make today, they ripple far beyond one lifetime. They echo through your children, through your grandchildren, your community, right? And even the people that you might not ever meet. When you shift your time horizon from years to generations down the road, everything changes. Your risk tolerance changes. Your leverage decisions change. Your patience increases, and your ego ends up decreasing. You become much more of a steward than an owner. You stop optimizing for applause in the marketplace, right? You start optimizing for endurance over the long haul. And this principle of thinking in generations, it's rooted in the fundamental rule of compounding. The longer the time horizon, the more powerful the compounding effect becomes. And that's true for money, but it's also true for knowledge. It's also true for relationships, reputation, character. All these things compound over long periods of time. Compounding does not just apply to capital. It applies to behavior. Warren Buffett captured this one beautifully. You guys all know this quote. Someone is sitting in the shade today because somebody planted a tree a long time ago. And that's what you have the luxury of doing. If we've become successful in the eyes of society, you make a couple of really quality decisions today, and decades from now, generations from now, kids, grandchildren, great-grandchildren can all benefit from the decisions that you make today. The person who planted that tree, they didn't benefit from the shade that it actually creates, right? But somebody else does. Somebody else did. And the same idea is derived from the great, unbelievable cathedrals of Europe. You've had the chance to spend a little bit of time out there. These buildings were built hundreds of years ago, but they took exceedingly long periods of time to put together. They were built over centuries. The people who laid the foundation, who laid that first stone, they knew that they were never going to ultimately see the finished ceiling at the end of the day, but they were driven by a vision of something that would ultimately outlast them over time. And that's generational thinking. So here's a number that really kind of resets perspective, right? We've talked about compound interest, and over long periods of time, it is the eighth wonder of the world. Let's emphasize it by extending that perspective just a little bit further. $1 million, a mere $1 million, compounded at a mere 5% rate for 200 years becomes over $17 trillion. 17 trillion. Again, the difference is not brilliance, it's duration and setting up a structure that allows for compound interest to take effect. Most families think in one lifetime. Dynasties think in centuries. And history gives us a couple of paths. You guys have seen it, right? Cornelius Vanderbilt. He died one of the richest men in the world. Within 3 generations, all that wealth was gone. He had no structure, had no generational design. And if you contrast that with the Rockefellers, multiple generations later, that wealth still endures. And the difference was not intelligence. Both of these individuals, exceedingly intelligent patriarchs. It was structure. That's the difference. And it began with a generational mindset. So the real question is not whether or not you can build wealth. You most assuredly can. We've played out a plan of exactly how to get to the promised land. The question is, what is the legacy that you want to leave? And how can you structure your wealth today so that it makes a positive impact on your family right now, your community, and the world long after you're gone? You now stand at that fork, right? You've become successful in the eyes of society. You can choose whether you just want to build wealth or whether you want to build wealth that lasts. And those are not the same thing. The second evergreen principle we have underneath Leave a Legacy is separate bedrock capital from lifestyle capital. You need to separate bedrock capital from lifestyle capital. Bedrock capital is untouchable principle. It compounds forever. And lifestyle capital ends up becoming everything else. It could be personal, discretionary spending, some consumption, some risk capital over and above what you would consider bedrock capital. Most families blend the two. And that's how fortunes die over time. But dynasties separate these two things. Many years ago, I read a book on J.P. Kennedy. He was the patriarch of the Kennedy family. A lot of people know John F. Kennedy, JFK, President of the United States, but far fewer people have ever even heard of J.P. Kennedy. The truth is, J.P. Kennedy is actually the patriarch of the Kennedy family. It's a renowned family that has multi-generational wealth, and J.P. Kennedy is the individual that ultimately set that up at the very beginning. How did he do it? When I read that book, I was unbelievably impressed with the foundation that he was able to lay. He was an exceptional entrepreneur, a great businessman who ultimately had multiple different businesses. He was a banker and made a lot of money in real estate along the way as well. And after he built wealth, right, once he created it, his true genius wasn't just wealth creation, it was wealth structure. So in 1926, he established a series of dynasty trusts with some ironclad rules. Number one, the heirs could never withdraw the principal. They could only live off of the interest and the income deriving from that principal. And then also another one of the beautiful aspects are he stipulated inside of the trust that that principal, which was never to be touched, was to be passed on to their children upon their death, basically setting up his grandkids as well. And that was going to last into perpetuity. And as you can imagine, as we've talked about, $1 million compounded at a mere 5% over 200 years becomes over $17 trillion. So he set his family up in such a way that the Bedrock capital will be there into perpetuity, continuing to compound for generations to come. And ultimately, that's how you leave a legacy to the next generation. So Kennedy was obviously adhering to the first two principles, right? He's already been thinking in generations, and he clearly understood how to separate bedrock capital from lifestyle capital. And, before we dive into that third sage principle today, I just want to plant a question. I just want to plant a question in your mind to tie legacy to the concept of wealth. Do you have an inner scorecard or do you have an outer scorecard? How do you view yourself? Do you have an inner scorecard or an outer scorecard? I will share that my biggest fear in life, my single biggest fear in life, I'm asked in, forums and entrepreneurial environments when you're really trying to get to know somebody, right? What is the single thing that you're most scared of in this world? And for me, I am petrified that my children, my two girls, will not know for want. And ultimately, they will grow up to be more versions of spoiled trust fund babies. I'm petrified in terms of how do I instill exceptional amounts of character into them, knowing where I came from. I'm an individual that grew up in a mobile home, didn't really come from much, ultimately built an 8-figure net worth, have done pretty successful for myself and my family over time. And I would never change the route that I took to ultimately get here, because that path of being forged through fire is ultimately where that character it derives. So I would never change it. And I never want to take that away from my next generation, right? From all of the kids that are in the house. But how do you try to put them in a position where they can struggle and build that character and move through adversity? My biggest fear is that they're not going to have that luxury. It's an odd dynamic because you obviously want better for the next generation, but on the flip side, you don't want to be able to give them too much and ultimately spoil them along the way. I'm petrified that I'm ultimately going to spoil the kids. So how do we go about solving that problem? The third principle is what we've ultimately decided is the best way to do it. And that third principle is to transfer wisdom before you transfer wealth. You have to pass along not only wealth, because that is not enough, but you also have to pass along wisdom along the way, sage wisdom. So continuing on the story with J.P. Kennedy, what did he ultimately do to try to pass along that level of wisdom to his kids and ultimately grandkids and great-grandkids beyond that? What he ended up doing was this. We talked about the principle, the vault, the bedrock capital that he set aside, only living off of that respective income. But then he set some other principles inside of his trust. And he said, look, the kids, they're not going to be able to tap into any of that respective income whatsoever until they're at least 36 years old. Why did he choose to do that? Why the age difference? Kennedy believed that his family, his children, they needed to prove themselves in the real world much earlier. They got to go out and build careers, stand on your own 2 feet, earn respect, establish an identity that is separate from the family wealth. And the result of that is by the time that the kids ultimately become 35 years old, they're kind of, becoming into the middle age, right? They by the time that they could actually access the income derived from the bedrock capital, they've already established themselves. They weren't just trust fund kids, trust fund babies. They were veterans. They were lawyers. They were public servants. The bedrock capital did not make them lazy. It made them fearless. Robert Kennedy could serve as an attorney general pursuing justice over corporate legal fees. Ted Kennedy, he could spend 47 years in the Senate focused on healthcare and civil rights. And that is exactly what J.P. Kennedy sought out to achieve when he ultimately built his family's legacy. When he sat down and he wrote the dynasty, what did he say? His entire life, His entire life's mission was that I want to build wealth. I want to build a large amount of wealth for my family so that we could pass it along and build a legacy that lasts for multiple generations. Why? Because he said, I want my family to be able to dedicate their lives to public service. And what an absolutely wonderful result that he has had, right? The principle, the Bedrock Capital, it compounded across generations. Kennedy's initial trusts that were estimated about $200, $300, maybe $400 million in today's dollars, they now support dozens of heirs while remaining structurally intact. The family has produced more than 16 members of Congress, diplomats, activists, authors, exceptionally successful individuals. That Bedrock Capital, it did not just preserve wealth, it funded legacy. And if you contrast that with the Vanderbilts, Cornelius Vanderbilt was the richest man in America in 1877. He left $100 million, which is about $2.5 billion today, to his heirs with no protective structure. But by 1973, less than 100 years later, just 96 years later, when 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered, not one of them was wealthy. The family fortune had evaporated. No bedrock capital, no structure, no dynasty. The difference between Kennedy and Vanderbilt was not intelligence, was not initial wealth. It was structure. Kennedy built bedrock. Vanderbilt didn't. You'll have to choose wisely. So how does this apply today, right? We're talking about stuff that occurred hundreds of years ago. How does that apply right now today for current real world folks seeking to build a legacy that lasts? What we would say is this. Look, I'm not an estate planning attorney. You'll have to sit down with yours and ultimately craft the trust and the mechanisms that you believe are best suited for you and your family as you progress. And I don't want to get that granular in this respective podcast. It's not the intent, but we'll just lay out a little bit of framework. One of the things that you need to do is determine your bedrock amount. Define your bedrock capital amount. What is the base that's going to go in the vault that is never to be sold? You have to define that, whatever it means for you and your family. You then need to sit down and establish an irrevocable dynasty trust, something that is able and capable of lasting for multiple generations. You also need to explain, again, in the interest of passing along not only wealth, but also wisdom, and wisdom before the wealth. You need to communicate the concept of the vault, of the bedrock capital, and the concept of the vault that it is never to be touched with your heirs. You also need to set age-based distribution milestones. Many, many, many families have had absolutely brutal results by too early in the tenure of a young adolescent, providing them with a windfall of cash. I'm sure that you can relate to this. When I was 22 years old, I knew everything. But the truth of the matter is, looking back multiple decades, I realize now how little I did know. I now today take a different perspective. I only know that I know nothing. Even though you are full of energy and wanting to take over the world, right? World domination is no longer on my to-do list. But at the time, it was. I mean, I was out there trying to take over the world. And the truth is, individuals that are at that age, they're still forming what they want and need to do for the rest of their lives. And it takes them a little bit of time to go out into the real world, get a real job, earn their own income, stand on their own 2 feet as a high-quality member of society. And only after they've gotten to that threshold, and that threshold will be dependent upon what you believe it to be for you and your children, but you need to set age-based distribution milestones so that the income that they're receiving only occurs after they have proven themselves to be men and women of high-quality character, so that they're not in precarious situations where they're focusing on the old drug, sex, and rock and roll sort of scenarios that you see far too many trust fund babies end up being in. In addition to that, you need to pair the bedrock capital with financial education. They need to know at least the basics. They might not want, espouse, or have the capacity to spend as much time, energy, and effort in finance as you do, as you grab the ball, as you hold the wheel, and you steer your family's financial foundation from the driver's seat. They might not have any interest in that, but they need to have the basic level of understanding. And I would also say that inside of your trust, you need to document your intent. Write down what your intent is with this respective capital. Ironclad rules, very similar to how J.P. Kennedy did. This is what this amount of Bedrock Capital is for. It is how it is to be used. It will not only go on to you as the heir, but also when you pass, it'll go on to your children as well, so on and so forth into perpetuity. Whatever that means for you, sit down and document your intent, because if you do not put it on paper on purpose in advance, I can promise the moment that one of those individuals has the ability to liquidate the trust, they will. The farther removed the individuals get from seeing the hard work, energy, and effort it took to ultimately build that first generation wealth. Oftentimes, the second generation can feel the impact and ramifications because they can see the hard work that is put into ultimately creating that. But the third generation typically is too far removed. They were not able to see that hard work put in. And because they did not see the price that you paid to build the wealth, they don't understand the value associated with the dollars. And it's very difficult for them to grasp it unless you put in place boundaries, rules, and document your intent in advance. And the last thing I'd say on the topic of just estate planning in general is to review and adapt it every decade, every 10 years, review it, adapt it, make sure that everybody's on the same page moving forward. Things change, and you just want to make sure that you keep it fresh for a million reasons. I will stop there. The intent is not to get exceedingly granular. It's to lay a framework for you so that you can think through how you might want to craft a similar dynasty trust for you and your family that can literally build a legacy to last for multiple generations. That's what I intend to do, and I hope that you have the luxury of doing the same for you and your family as you progress. So while separating bedrock capital from your lifestyle capital is one of the most important decisions that you're going to make for your family for the next multiple hundreds of years, the third principle is just as critical. You have to transfer wisdom before wealth, because money without judgment is dangerous, and the history proves it. Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first generation builds it, second one maintains it, third one dissipates it, because wealth was transferred, but the thinking was not. Benjamin Franklin's got a great quote on this, right? An investment in knowledge pays the best interest. And Charlie Munger, in his typical quippy fashion, says it very concisely: go to bed smarter than when you woke up. If you can pass along the capital strategy framework, if your heirs understand margin of safety, patience, tax efficiency, stewardship, the inner scorecard discipline, then wealth has a fighting chance. But if they don't, it's just a countdown clock. So you have to transfer wisdom before wealth and not after. So I just hinted at the idea of the inner scorecard again, and let's kind of revisit that, go a little bit deeper. It actually brings me back to Warren Buffett. You know, Buffett at one point was the wealthiest individual on the entire planet. He built a business from $0 to $1 trillion in one generation. It's absolutely amazing, right? But his ultimate objective was not money. It was living with an internal scorecard. One of the favorite things that I've really come to understand is the idea of the difference between the having an inner scorecard or an outer scorecard. And the big question about how people behave is really, whether they've got an inner scorecard or an outer scorecard. I really do believe it's really the only way that you can actually be happy in life is to have an inner scorecard. And, it ties into one of these John Wooden quotes that I love as well. John Wooden has conveyed that, your reputation is different than your character. Your reputation is what other people think you are, but your character is what you actually are. And that's the difference between an inner scorecard and an outer scorecard. I'm going to quote Warren Buffett directly here. Warren Buffett said, "I always pose it this way." I say, look, if the world couldn't see your results, would you rather be thought of as the world's greatest investor, but in reality have the world's worst record? Or would you rather be thought of as the world's worst investor when you actually have the best? And that's obviously a really phenomenal metaphor, right? He goes on to explain that if all of the emphasis is on what the world is going to think about you, forgetting about how you really behave, you're going to wind up with an outer scorecard. And Buffett learned this lesson from his father, right? So he says, look, my dad, he was a 100% inner scorecard guy. That knowledge was passed along from generation to generation. He espouses it. And I absolutely love that principle of having an inner scorecard. At the end of the day, when you lay your head down at night, did you know that you worked your hardest? Did you know that you have exceptional character? You're a man of integrity. You're doing what you say you're going to do. And honestly, it's not about money. If you're simply trying to accumulate money to impress the world, to impress other individuals, you need to spend a little bit of time looking in the mirror, because that's not going to give you happiness. You have to be focused on your own internal scorecard. What are you trying to achieve for yourself and your family and have the biggest impact possible while you're here? That's what actually matters most. Buffett went on to say that his dad was a maverick, right? He was a maverick, not a maverick for the sake of being a maverick. He just didn't care about what other people thought. His dad taught him how life should be lived. He's never seen anybody quite like it, right? Buffett said he's never seen anybody quite like it. For me, I try to live my life focusing on the idea and the concept of an inner scorecard for this reason. And that kind of ties us back into the idea and the concept of happiness, right? That money doesn't buy happiness. In order to really be happy, you got to live a life such that people will miss you when you're gone. And we love studying history's greatest investors, history's greatest entrepreneurs, businessmen, so I can personally continue to get better as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, to grow the business and be a better capital allocator to grow wealth over time. But as you go through all of that study, you also come to realize when you read biographies of all the individuals that have been so unbelievably successful financially in the eyes of society, you also come to realize that some of them have an absolute train wreck of a personal life. So you come to appreciate some who espouse the character and the principles that you want to espouse in your life. And you also have the luxury of seeing some of the mistakes that individuals have made over time and trying to avoid those mistakes, right? If I've seen further than others, it is only because I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And one such example is Warren Buffett speaking about his own individual personal life. Towards the end of his journey, late in his life, his wife was unfortunately very sick. She was going to pass away very soon. And he was actually giving a speech, as he often does. He went to the local university. I think he was at Georgia Tech. And he was giving a speech. And he was just asked a lot of questions from the local adolescents there. And somebody asked him what had been, his greatest success in life, or maybe what his greatest failure was. And oftentimes he'll talk about his mistakes of omission in terms of investments, things that he hasn't pulled the trigger on. But this time he didn't. Instead, he said, basically when you get to my age, you really measure your success in life by how many of the people that you want to have love you actually do love you. I know people who have a lot of money and they get testimonial dinners and they get hospital wings named after them. But the truth is that nobody in the world loves them. And if you get to my age and life and nobody thinks well of you, I don't care how big your bank account is, your life is a disaster. And that's the ultimate test of how you've lived your life. The trouble with love is that you can't buy it. You can buy a lot of things in life, right? You can buy testimonial dinners. You could buy pamphlets that say how wonderful you are. But the only way to get love is to be lovable. And it's very irritating, right, for people that are successful, that have a lot of money. You'd like to think that you could just write a check. You say, I buy $1 million worth of love, please. But it doesn't work that way. The more you give love away, the more that you get. And from my perspective, that is why estate planning and building a legacy that lasts is the ultimate love letter. You're passing along not only wealth, but wisdom at the end of the day, so that, as we've mentioned, when you're no longer there, people will miss you when you're gone. And that's the ultimate love letter that you can leave to your family. So if you follow that capital strategy with discipline, you're going to build wealth. But wealth is not the prize. The prize is becoming a sage investor, a wise steward of capital, somebody who thinks in generations, who separates bedrock capital from lifestyle capital, who transfers wisdom before wealth, who operates from an inner scorecard, who builds freedom for others, right? Who builds freedom of time, freedom of money, freedom of relationship, freedom of purpose. You can win financially and lose generationally. Or you can plant trees today whose seeds grow into massive oak trees that create shade that you're never personally going to sit under. But that is a legacy that's built to last. And if you do it correctly, when you lay your head down at night, your inner scorecard will most assuredly be satisfied. And when you're gone, people will miss you, not because of your bank account, but because of your character, because of what you protected, because of what you passed along, because of the love letter that you wrote with your life. So that sums it up. We've gone through every single one of the 7 pillars of the Sunrise Capital strategy in detail. So on the next episode, what we're going to do is we're going to show you a case study, real life, real world example of what happens when you buy a property and you actually implement the entirety of that capital strategy. How does it actually play out in the real world? We're going to do a deep dive on a real deal that's making real money that we still own today, that's throwing off cash flow and generating legacy wealth in a tax-efficient manner, because that's what I want for my family. And we're going to help as many people as possible do that as we can along the way. But until next time,